Hello and welcome to our Talkback for Remnant, and thank you to Teatro Mitu. You know, I always call it teatro. I was like, it's theater, and I was like, Teatro Mitu. Anyway, Theater Mitu for coming out and sharing their work here with Brown and stopping us from our constant sort of election anxiety fatigue tonight. For those of you who might know, this presentation has been a bit of a journey. We had planned this event well before the COVID pandemic. And waited anxiously to see how and when we'd be able to present it. And we had a lot of really great conversations in spring and summer and thought about how we might do it. And the company actually converted an entire immersive theater piece that was going to be live into this format, which was just really astounding. So a number of the company members are here, but I'm going to start first with the people who I've worked most with in this, which are Justin Nestor and Ruben Polendo. And I'll read a couple brief bios here. So Justin is a co-founding director of Theater Mitu, and he's a performer, researcher, and technologist. His work focuses on narrative archaeology, corporeal archive, and technology as a performer. He's an interdisciplinary artist who creates installations and works for the stage, which explore the tension and overlap between performance, visual art, and technology. And I think you can actually really see that here in the creation of this piece. Ruben Polendo is the founding artistic director of this permanent group of collaborators, Teatro Mitu. And he and his company work towards expanding the definition of theater through rigorous experimentation and form. Polendo and his company research and investigate global performance as a source of their training, work, and methodologies. And I think we can actually see that in the great range of influences that we've seen here tonight. He is also an arts professor and chair at NYU Drama. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ruben to make a few more introductions. And then I have a few questions, or if Jay has questions, or we can all ask each other questions so that we can talk about this important work.
Great. Thank you so much, Patti. Before we formally start, I just want to take a moment to thank you for all your work and your partnership in making this happen, and to thank the Department of Theater Arts and Performance Studies and the Brown Arts Initiative. It's been really a great collaboration in a moment where I think collaboration is so essential. And I also just want to name, as you did, that it is, complicated is an understatement of the contemporary moment, and that's taking up a lot of heart space and mind space. And so I'm very grateful to be in a different kind of space that hopefully gives some oxygen into the room, and to discuss both the work and the ongoing collaboration. So thank you for that. And I'll introduce company members who have joined us. Dennis Butkus, who is one of our company members, Alex Hawthorne, Isabella Euskategui, who you see in the screen, Ada Westfall, and also one of our apprentices with Theater Mitu presently, Monica Sanborn. It's also worth noting that we represent the work of the entire company. We have about a third of the company here. I always like to acknowledge that it takes a whole host of us to do the work. And so I want to acknowledge those voices as well. But thank you so much, and I'm happy and eager for us to chat through the work.
Great. And we're going to it's in the chat, but we're just going to record this conversation just for class use, for students to be able to watch this conversation as they are themselves moving into creating theater and performance in some really radically different ways than we have in the past. So I actually have a couple of questions, and I'm glad to just start and we can add. So, I mean, the first is perhaps exactly that, about this process of transforming this work from an immersive spatial piece that was meant to be sequential in terms of the experience, and how you started thinking about it as an audio or radio play. I mean, it was a very audio heavy show, I think, even in its original form. So I'm just wondering how the process of just really changing the medium in which this performance was to happen happened.
Yeah, I'm actually particularly excited to have this conversation here, because you are directly linked to that process, Patti, in a very direct way. Before I go into that, I just have to say it's funny that you that your habit leads you to call it Teatro Mitu, right? because people always in English want to call us Me Too theater, like the public theater or anything blank theater. But Theater Mitu is actually in Spanish grammar, and so it's that's how we name things in Spanish, teatro something. So it's always in my mind as a kind of Spanish grammar. So I appreciate you picking up on that, which is my own language. I appreciate the habit, but to me actually. It goes without saying that the I'll for a second bypass the political landscape and speak of the public health landscape.
Mhm.
It goes without saying that in March, if not before, the world was turned upside down and sideways at the same time. And I think it of course brought a whole host of challenges and tragedies on a global scale. But as we began to enter with much resistance what was to be the new normal, at least for a moment, the question really became about the role of artists. It was interesting for me to see a range of reactions. I saw a lot of nervousness in artists communicating and saying art matters, and so we make art and so forth. And I actually had an odd reaction to that, and we discussed it as a company because I felt like no one's saying it doesn't matter. Why is everyone so kind of coming out to defend art? Like I think everyone's just catching their breath, and I think there's a moment where I think artists need to observe and reflect and so forth. So that kind of nervousness was interesting to watch. There was another kind of reaction, which was we're just gonna go steam ahead and pretend this isn't happening and find these substitutes. In other words, we're gonna just do the same play, but on Zoom, and we're gonna do the same thing, but on Skype. Like it became these kind of proxy processes. But there was a kind of third approach that we were most interested in, and it really aligned with us, which became a question of how can this, and I hesitate to use the word opportunity as tethered to anything to the pandemic, but how can we look at this as a moment of innovation, of growth, where in fact it's inviting us to really question the foundations of what we make and how we make and our role as artists, and to actually really force ourselves to have mind space for that, even in a moment where we're trying to understand how to buy groceries, right? And I feel very fortunate because as a company, the great joy of us as a theater company that's been together for decades is that there is a community to come to. And to me, I share this with students all the time, that it's so important as artists to have a company. And by that, I don't mean a company with a name and whatever, a tax ID or whatever, but I mean who you keep company with, who you come together to have an ongoing dialogue, not a kind of new one. So for us, it was a really great thing to come together and ask that question. This linked to continuing our conversation about the relationship between Theater Mitu and Brown. And I remember so clearly, this had already been seeded in our own conversations about focusing on the audio experience and what is the essence of theater, which is such a limitless form that is beyond walls, and how can we actually really let go of that. So we came to, I remember the meeting with you, and we were talking about there has to be a way to make this happen. And it's that really birthed the idea of what about actually really engaging simply in pivoting the sensory experience. So it's no longer a sensory experience about location or a sensory experience about kind of being in a space with individuals, but it's a sensory experience that leans into the aural, the visual, right? But still really using as our Northern Star, the theatrical, which is really the kind of grammar. So it's not about all of a sudden making a film or video art, but really making theater in its core essence. And that conversation was born with us, like literally, like when you were there, Patsy, we were like, "Why do we do this?" And to me, I feel like that's how it gets done, right? Which is right. The spark of wanting to move forward, because we could have, and I'm very grateful to you, because we could have all raised our hands and said, "Well, there goes that plan of Theater Mitu doing something with Brown." Like, no way, right? But we stayed stubborn, and I feel like that's such a great tool. And so that's actually what started propelling us into this kind of sensory space and interactive space, and to really look at the core of what the piece is talking about. And the last thing I'll mention, then I'll pass it over to Justin in terms of comments around this, but it became such an interesting and deep dive to go into this piece that we started researching and making years ago, and to really have it speak to us in a different way, because the core conversation to us is not only about the subject of loss, but about how loss can often actually reaffirm what we're fighting for, and that's a really actually difficult and challenging process. And loss can be large, small, tragic, of all ranges. And to view that in a moment where we were seeing loss all around us in the public
Mm.
landscape of health, in the political landscape, it really kind of aligned for us, and that really became another orienter in terms of that. So that's just a little of a kind of philosophical framework to the work. Justin, I don't know if you want to add anything as we started going into the making of it.
Um, I th- I think for us, many of us, our primary disciplines either sit, uh, they don't always sit squarely in theater. And for me, and I think for a lot of the other artists in the company, Theater Mitu became an artistic home because it allowed for a place for us to kind of collide all our different practices together. And so I often say I'm an artist first and a theater maker second. Making theater is a form through which I can ask questions and incite dialogue. And I think that's a commonality between most of us as artists. And so, in that sense, adapting this piece wasn't. The idea of adapting it wasn't difficult at all. It felt really natural. We had spent 2+ years with the source material, and figured out in its first iteration how to compose it into a live performance event. But the source material, was still the catalyst for creation. And so to return to that source material and say, okay, what is another vehicle? Not the best vehicle or the most convenient for this moment, but what is actually just another way of creating access? And I think that's been for us the biggest conversation in this moment, which is, we still have tools to create. And so the question isn't, should we make, or is it live, or is it theater, but actually, how do we use the tools we have to create within the givens of this moment and create access to our work and access to these stories and conversations and questions that I think we spent so long with. And so that piece, I think, has been really thrilling. I mean, this went from being, we thought, okay, we're just going to do like a 3-part audio, almost like a podcast. And then I was like, well, we want people to really sort of sit and be physically still in space, not listen to it on the subway. Okay, well, but then we have to give them something to look at. So now we're developing sort of 60 minutes worth of visual content, and adapting that from the original media. And then we thought, okay, well, we don't want to remove people's agency in how they experience the what all, for lack of a better term, the narrative of the experience, because that was something that we really valued in the in-person. And so we thought, okay, well, there's a language for this on the internet and in a web browser, and can we adapt that to give people a little bit of agency in terms of how they experience it? So it was really a long conversation about access and how do we create more and new access points to material that I think we found really inspiring, initially when we worked on this piece starting back in 2016. I think is probably when we started. So
Great. Are there other thoughts?
I'll just throw in, Alex, I'm wondering if you could talk a little, and then I'll ask Ada to comment on it. Just in terms of the process, it's worth noting that Alex, one of the lead roles he plays in the company, is really looking at the cohesion of the aural landscape. And this was in its initial phase, really focusing on a kind of 3-dimensional recording space. And we use binaural recordings and so forth. It's worth noting that the in-person sibling of what folks would have experienced was experienced on headphones. You entered into a theater space and wore headphones. So this is why also that aural experience is really key. And even though we actually don't work in a theater contractor model, in other words, we don't have a set designer and a sound designer and an actor, we make the work together. When the rubber hits the road, we do take certain kind of lead actions. And as we crafted this, Alex really deployed his own skills and practice in terms of sound making, sound design into the piece. And so I'm wondering, Alex, if you could talk a little bit about that, I'll call it translation into the piece that we shared with Brown.
It's interesting because it was both a, it was from beginning to end an enjoyable process to revisit a show, a product of which I am so proud. And in a way, it was both a very easy lift on my end and an extremely heavy lift, because we were taking something that was already created, designed to be experienced on headphones, and then upping the ante, saying, okay, and there are no live performers. So now anything that was produced live, which is both, you know, the spoken word, but it's also a number of contextual clues about the piece, we now have to sort of recreate in a frozen, fixed environment, as it were. And so, you know, it was fun getting all of these voiceovers from the rest of the company and revisiting this language that I had listened to so much during our initial creation phase. And then it was about figuring out what this medium invited in terms of the lift. Like, what, there was the version which, and I think we all had these moments of like, okay, well, we could do X and simply recreate a version of the live theatrical experience. But that's completely possible. But like, what are we able to do in this moment, having sat with the material for an additional 2 years? Like, what do we now know that we can augment in this moment? And so it did have a lot to do with like placement of the voices across the sort of, you know, the stereo field of the left and right. But it also had to do with distance and quality and timbre of the voices. And so really trying to create a sense of possibly, you know, character or some sort of identifiable sonic signature that can give people a touchstone as they move through this process. And keeping things interesting. You know, we probably, for worse, not for better, our attention spans are getting shorter. And so, you know, you see a video on Instagram and 30 seconds in, you're like, oh, is it done yet? I want to move on with my life. And we're asking for somebody to sit for 20 minutes with an experience. And so, you know, what were the tools in my toolbox that I had in order to try and keep hooking the audience and bringing them further and further into the piece?
And if it's okay, Patty, I'll invite Ada. I don't know if you have any thoughts, as Ada was particularly a lead voice in the work of the video landscape for this particular iteration. If you could talk a little bit about that translation process.
Yeah, so this was, to echo what Alex was saying, it was a particularly heavy lift in that it was fairly new territory for me. As Ruben was saying, we all sort of, in our sort of, in the most normal version of our process, we all share the load of creation very equally, and everyone is wearing a lot of hats. A lot of the video content, much of which appears in this version as it did in screens sort of around us on stage in the original, was sourced and edited and conceived of by, you know, members, probably every member in the company, I would say. But we made a decision early on when in settling on the idea that we didn't actually want to sit with images of, let me put it simpler. We didn't want to have you sit through a video of theater, right? A video of the show, because that inherently communicates the idea that you're watching something that's compromised, right? You're watching the secondhand, after the fact version, and you know, if you didn't see it in real life, then you're sort of getting this this 2D version of it, and so we decided that, you know, for reasons both artistic and you know, simply logistical, budgetary, we don't have $1 million. We can't rebuild sets in everybody's houses and stuff. So we said, what are ways that we can sort of address the images that would have been conveyed normally by bodies in space performing movement, you know, things like that, but solely with visual content and audio content. And since Alex had created such a rich audio landscape already in the piece, which granted, as he said, he sort of augmented in this next draft, and of course had to reckon with replacing the pieces that were delivered into microphones live. I was presented with the challenge of what to do about sections of the show, of which there are many, where when we performed it on stage, it was bodies in space, and there actually was no video content in particular moments. And so that became a challenge for me as sort of as a video editor, which normally I function mainly as a musician in my larger artistic practice. And so even though I have video experience in the work that I've done with the company, I really became an editor in this process in a way that I've never been before. Certainly not for 60 minutes worth of material ever. And so the question became, how do I retain the sort of spirit and thrust of each section of the show, but without and not compromise it, but using new material. And so what I turned to, after some experimentation, what I quickly realized was that in the way that we build these shows, I'd say all of our pieces, especially after a certain point in our journey together artistically as a company, well, a few pieces back, we are constantly iterating and archiving all kinds of material that does not actually make it into the show. There's sort of a culling, as with any artistic process, you write too much of a play and then you cut it down to the pieces that matter, right? And so in the sense, we make too much stuff and then we sort of cull it back to the the thing that you need to see, and and so there's actually a lot, so to speak, left on the cutting room floor. And so I was able to go back and actually re-engage with the years of research that we had done and other video material that we had compiled that for various reasons hadn't made it in, and find new context for those things. Just to give an example, in box A, there's a whole song. It's the one that sort of turns into the Kate Bush song with Army Dreamers at the end. And in the original iteration of the piece, that's all physical activity that's happening on stage. And so, not to sit in that, I dug through our sort of hard drive of stuff that we'd accrued and discovered that wonderful footage of all that lava flowing. And Ruben made this lovely observation that if it was played backwards, at times there were parts where the lava was actually, engulfing living plants. And as we're speaking about soldiers and war and trauma and, of course, death throughout the entire piece, and we're sort of watching this man relive his experience and find a moment of healing in front of his husband. Now suddenly that footage that we kind of had never thought about in that way before revealed itself that if we played it backwards, you saw life springing back to life. And suddenly that footage that 2 years ago in the crossfire of trying to create this thing and make choices had been seen in a certain way, and we said, I don't know if it belongs. And it was so cool to go back and go, oh, no. We actually don't need to go source more stuff. We don't need to make more stuff. We actually have it all. And the question becomes, or the challenge becomes, how to re-engage our generative brain with stuff that we already have and use it to augment and satisfy this goal we laid out for ourselves. And I think it came out pretty cool.
I did too.
And I'll just footnote, and again, we talk a lot about these things, so Patti, feel free to interrupt me, but there's a couple of words that Ada mentioned that are really important to our practice, and I always kind of wave this flag, particularly as students are exploring and engaging in their practice. And one is, with the work with Theater Mitu, we really work in an anti-disciplinary mode, which is to really move away from the idea of having any individual claim a particular discipline. And with that, I want to partner another word, which is then the action of work for us is a transdisciplinary one, which is to say, we actually, as I joke, I say we like misbehaving, which is one of the reasons that to me Ada makes a really exciting video editor, video editing choices is not because of great training for decades on video editing, but because she edits with her musician composer brain. And so what happens then is there's this gorgeous rhythm that is almost musicality, right? And this is what I mean about the kind of trance, which is it's not the space of the expert in video editing, but it's a third space, one that actually brings the expertise the artist has into a new craft or making. And so we end up with really exciting discoveries. And so these are really key words for our process as we talk through that.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask about collaboration. I don't know, Jay, if you have other things you want to ask, actually, but you laid out the collaboration beautifully.
Yeah, I also had questions about just like, I guess, the process of collaboration, since there are so many of you, and how that works out. And then another question that I had is, what does the sensory space offer to like dealing with violence and war and images of death? And specifically, I would ask that in relationship to what I saw as like a fragmentation of body parts, which was part of what was so compelling to me and drew me in very much to the experience.
Yeah, that's great. It's actually such a the last question aligns so beautifully with the way that we work. So I'll start there, and then maybe in a moment I'll pass it to other folks on the collaboration a little bit more on that. But you know, I think for us there's a couple of things that are important. One is I think often when, you know, I'll speak again, it's hard not to speak of the contemporary moment, right? But there's a way that when I, you know, open the newspaper or click on the website, whether it's about politics, about violence in the world, about the public health landscape, I feel like as I should, I'm staring at the sun, like I'm looking at the information and, you know, the data and the percentages and the infection rate, right? And that's important as a citizen at this moment. But as with looking at the sun, my eyes begin to hurt. I can't do it for a long time. But it's, you know, I have to. I want to know what's happening in the election and the, you know, infection rates in my area. One of our arguments has always been that this kind of propensity and access to staring at the sun, whatever that information is, often compromises the ability to actually reflect and have a meditative stance on the conversation. And our argument is that space of reflection and meditation is actually a space of discovery. It can be a space of healing. It can be a space of just locating yourself in the conversation. And so often, even though our work approaches these very large, heavy subjects, we really hone ourselves to not stare at the sun, to not say, we're going to show you images of violence. Here is, you know, a scene with two soldiers fighting in a war, or here, right? We actually don't want to look at the sun. We actually want to look away for the sun and reflect for a moment. And so what that means is then we begin to engage in a more associative grammar of visuals, which is, you know, we don't want to invite you to view an actor performing a breakdown of a soldier. We actually want you to hear the language and see an image that speaks to another part of your brain and your heart and begins to create almost a composition of ideas. And so as Alex hesitates using, you hear us make these caveats of hesitating to use words like character and narrative and things, because we really don't use that in our work as we make work. We really are looking at these spaces that are meditative and reflective, and really are driven by a question. And so that often deals with a fracturing of the image, of the sound, and of the body. And so you rarely see this in our work. You rarely see any kind of reenactment with any verisimilitude. So you wouldn't see, whether that's emotionally, you'll never see an actor perform a text in a way where they're, you know, acting and engaging in the verisimilitude of what that moment looks like. We often fracture that text. We often fracture that behavior. You know, there's a section in one of the pieces where you see first one of the company members, Theater, and another time Justin, they hold up their leg in a kind of consistent way and kind of offer it. And that really is a kind of interjection, as we spoke to folks in the military, of how many conversations are ghosting through the return from war. not only PTSD, not only integration into society, but things like your medical health. Prosthetics comes up a lot. The offering of the body in combat and what you return with, right? And so all of a sudden that became this way of kind of conjuring that ghost in the conversation without replaying a scene of somebody losing a body part or something like this. So that does begin the fracturing, and that actually points a little bit to how we collaborate, which is a space. The only way I can typify it, I mean, I can talk about transdisciplinarity and so forth, but one of the things that I always located in is we are a really arguey company, and to us that's really important. We don't, one of the big things for me is collaboration. To me is not agreement, and it is not democracy. We don't vote on choices. We don't try to choose the thing that placates the conversation to its lowest common denominator. I believe that collaboration is collision. It's ideas coming into a space of tension with each other and really creating something new, and doing so gracefully and respectfully, right? And so we, get red in the face with each other. We're like, how can you say you can't? And we reach this kind of full density that the only next way of arguing is to create. And to create, then we bring those things together. And what we land on is, I hope, something that actually reflects all of those points of tension, so that the work is not didactic. We, Theater Mitu, believe this about violence or war, but going back to the body, it's fractured, which is Justin believes something about the military, I something else. We had an interview, they offered something else. We did some archival research, that brought something else. So that begins to make these many kind of points of access, and our archive becomes really important. And so, DB, if I could pass it to you, Dennis, on that conversation in terms of that collaboration and archive.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Thanks for having us again. It's really a pleasure to be talking about this in this new format. And I was listening to Ada and Alex talk, and I was thinking how important our research is for collecting all of that information that you could then draw upon. And I feel like, we did a lot of research on this project. We traveled to many different countries. We talked to hundreds of different people. And all of that sits in a hard drive that then they can pull off of to supplement the work. And I think that's really unique. It's definitely not a way that I've ever worked. I'm trained as an actor, and so I'm by no means an archivist at all. But I have this great fascination with collecting all kinds of different materials that is sort of focused on a theme. And I think, this theme of what have we left behind, or what is a trace, or what is a remnant, or what is a memory, is a really provocative kind of place to begin a conversation with a whole group of different people. And it acts as kind of a prompt to begin to say, okay, how do we intersect with all of these different perspectives? How do we create access points in our work that are actually open and available? I think in a perfect world, we would love you to be able to get in and look at our archive to see all of the stuff that we have, because it's really quite dynamic. But of course, nobody has the time to write all that metadata. So it becomes sort of stuck on a hard drive, but not unuseful. It's a very useful thing. And it's nice to see how it all of a sudden resists time. I think one of the things about theater for me is its temporality, right? And there is this sense that it just sort of disappears. It's like writing in water. And what we have sort of created in our process is a way to go back in time and to grab an interview that was 4 years ago or 5 years ago, and revisit an image from that interview, which you saw one of those images in the box with the Marine and his husband. That was actually an interview that we conducted, and to see that, and this is the first time that I've seen it, because of course I was performing in one of the other boxes, and it was immediately moving to me because I of course was at that interview, and I had this really interesting different connection to the piece. And I know that people who have seen it and have seen that interview and were a part of it were like, oh wow, I didn't realize that, and it's so poignant. That that's one of those things that was in an archive that we pulled out and that we brought into the piece. So that's just an example of kind of where our archival work sits, and it really comes from research. We do a lot of research on these projects. We spend 2 or 3 years collecting interviews, collecting material, collecting images and texts, and we talk about them, we argue about them a lot, and they all sort of filter into this piece. So So yeah, I think that about sums it up.
Yeah, I think, and I'll just go one more level into that, which is oftentimes, and I love your use, Jay, of the word of this kind of fracturing, right, of the body, and because it really speaks to the way that our minds work. And one of the things in the collaboration that to us is really important has to do with how we perform this archive, right? I think we started doing a kind of work with Theater Mitu many years ago, where we acknowledged, because we were sourcing not only historical and archival spaces, but also a whole set of interviews, but not in the mode that a documentary theater piece would. In other words, we did not have an interest in bringing that interview and embodying it and manifesting it as that character, say in the style of a Laramie project or an Anna Devere Smith piece or something of this nature. But we had an interest in the performer functioning almost as a transmitter rather than as someone who embodies character. And so this started to take on a kind of different style of performance, and one that was really attuned to the fullness of what role that performance took with the visual, the aural, and so forth, versus having the performance be the privileged thing with everything else as background, right? And so, if I may, Isa, who's one of the newest company members, I know has had quite a growth curve in engaging in that acting style as a trained actor, and engaging in that. So, Isa, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that growth curve.
Yeah. It's a great challenge for me as mostly a trained actor, to sort of embody this performer that transmits instead of like living or emoting or having a character work or something. And it was very interesting when I first encountered working on Remnant, because I took on a role of a previous company member. And so it was about like taking on very quickly something that was transferable to me and transferable to anybody. So what's very interesting is like Dennis could be playing another part in another box, because it's just like very fluid that way. And then there were some elements about it that were very new to me, such we have in-ears, so we get transmitted our dialogue or what we say, the interviews on our ears. So that's very new. Other stuff that's very new is we do a lot of mimic work. So it's sometimes very challenging to do work based off of like, you see the mimic and then you very quickly have to do it with your bodies. And then at the same time, say what's going on in your ear. And at the same time, try to look at the partner and try to speak in the mic and hear your voice. So it's like a soup of many different things. And it's definitely challenging, but definitely a very new way of working as an actor, and also working as a writer and working as someone who has opinions and musician and other things, not just here's my character, here's my script and go, yeah.
Which is always, which then breeds a kind of style, which I think is what we're hoping gives access to the piece and doesn't color it. But yeah.
Thank you. I'm mindful of time, and I don't know that I have a lot of other questions. I just want to make just a couple of comments. It's so interesting that fragmentation is also something I noticed, but I really thought of the very different context for mourning and loss that we're at this particular moment, and how even this was made in a different moment, how we recontextualize it sort of ourselves as audience members. And so I was very, very aware of that. And it's funny, I'm very aware of these sort of military legacies too. And we are aware and not aware of that at this moment. But as someone who does have a military legacy in their family, it's just an incredibly moving piece from this, thinking about what passes, like what stays behind generation over generation, which was not explicit in the piece, but was very, 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 very implicit in the piece. Right. So it's just a beautiful piece. And thank you so much for laying out how you work. I think it'll be really inspiring to our students who tend to want to break these boundaries, but don't always have a model for how to do that. But I think again, I would never think that something is an opportunity, but something that's interesting that's happened, I think, is a lot of our people who are trained primarily as performers are now learning to work in these different medium, and they look at working with technology different according to what they're trained in. So it's actually it's an interesting time to do this kind of work. But other than that, I just want to thank Theater Mitu and thank the Brown Arts Initiative, Greg and Sean, and for just sharing this work with us and just inspiring us as audiences to work in this way. So thank you for all your generosity.
Thank you so much. And thanks again, Patti. Thank you, Jay. And thank you to everyone
Yes,
for
thank you very
inviting us
much.
to this.
Thank you.